Bonjour à toi. Bienvenue à mon discours sur l'intégration continue avec GitHub, SFDX, et CIRCLECI. I'm going to stop butchering the French language now and speak in English. So, welcome to my talk on continuous integration with GitHub, SFDX, and CIRCLECI. My name is Mick Wheeler. I'm a software engineer for OVO Energy in Bristol in the United Kingdom. We're the largest independent energy supplier in the UK, and now actually we're opening in France soon. So, let's get into it. What's the problem with the current setup, the current way we deploy and develop in Salesforce? You know, change sets are fine. We've been using them for years. That's, you know, it kind of works, right? Well, anybody who's used change sets for any sort of length of time will understand that there are some problems with this method. The primary issue is there's no real source of truth. So you've got your production org, which is supposed to be the source of truth, but as we all know, people can and will make changes in production, and it won't be tracked, and all of a sudden something's going to break, and you don't know why or how or what happened. You don't really have a safety net. You might have a sandbox that you made with a copy of prod that worked, but maybe it doesn't exist anymore, maybe it's out of date, who knows. And if you've ever had to put more than 5 or so items in a change set, you know it's a slow and painful process. Adding all the things, especially if they're across, you know, objects, fields, classes, you've got to go in and out of that screen so many times. It's a massive pain. And then you have to deploy it between your environments, and you have to wait, and maybe it'll show up in 10 minutes, maybe it'll take an hour, who knows. And then all of these problems get so much worse when you've got more than one person working on your org. You could easily step on each other's toes. You can easily overwrite each other's changes and lose work, and that's not good. And you don't really have a great way of auditing what's happened, what's changed, etc. So how do we actually fix this? So one of the answers, or probably the answer that most other software engineering processes, platforms, etc. use, is continuous integration. So let's talk about what continuous integration is first. It's two things. It's a development practice, and it's a set of tools, and that's how I'm kind of going to describe it here. When you're following a continuous integration process, you're checking in your code into a source control repository, Git, GitHub, Bitbucket, etc. Your continuous integration tool is automatically verifying your changes. It's running tests, it's pushing it to a scratch org or something, it's running things like linting and static analysis. That allows you to find issues early. If you've got something that doesn't work, that interrupts or interferes with something else, your CI will flag it to you. The set of tools that you need for CI to be successful is source code management, as mentioned before, Git. You need developer tooling that actually lets you push and pull your code around, so that would be the Salesforce CLI, or SFDX as we used to call it. And then you need an orchestration tool or a CI pipeline. That's what actually does the work here. So let's go through each of these kind of pieces in a bit more detail. So I'm going to be talking about GitHub for the purposes of this, but the same applies to any other sort of Git provider. When we're using this development model, GitHub becomes your source of truth. Your production org is no longer your source of truth, it's just where your code gets run for your users. When your code is in a Git repository, you have a nice safety net. Git is entirely built on versioning, so every time you make a change, you commit a new version, the old one is still available. So you can see what changed, who changed it, when, etc., etc. Git also has branches, which allow you to maintain multiple versions of your application. So you're going to fix a bug or implement a new feature, you create a new branch for that. It has a copy of your current production instance in it, plus whatever changes you make. So your bug fix or your new feature, whatever. Every change you make is tracked, it's auditable, you can revert. If you commit something and it breaks everything, you can revert that commit and take it back to how it was before you did that. And you have the powerful tools like pull requests that allow you to review code, each other's code, other members of your team's code with ease. So the next thing we have is SFDX, or the Salesforce CLI. This is the glue that holds all of this together. Prior to this tooling existing, we had things like Ant and whatever, but it wasn't that user-friendly, didn't work that well. SFDX is very, very powerful and allows you to do all of this. So a good IDE, so VS Code, or in Illuminated Cloud will integrate SFDX and Git into it and will allow you to use those tools inside of it. And the Salesforce CLI is incredibly powerful. It can be scripted easily, it makes CI possible or easy, and it makes your life as a developer easy. And finally, we've got the continuous integration tool. In this case, we're talking about CIRCLECI, but it equally could be Travis or Jenkins or varying other continuous integration tools out there. This tool is an automation and a deployment tool. So it listens for changes made to your Git repositories and runs some tasks based on those changes. So it might verify your code, it might deploy it to an org, all of that sort of thing, which we'll get into shortly. So that's enough of me going on about it. Let's have a little look at how it works. So I'm going to start by setting up GitHub. So I'm going to create a new repository for my code. So we'll just wait for it to load. Come on, GitHub. I'm just going to disconnect from there. Oh, there we go, right. You don't see my screen. Excellent. Let's just switch, hopefully. Ooh. There we go. Right, so I'm going to create a new repository in GitHub. I'm going to call this FTD 2019, and we'll create that. So GitHub gives you some helpful information on the commands you can run to set up your Git repository. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm assuming that I've already been using an IDE, I've got my code in a folder on my local machine that I'm already working with. So we've got it in here, so let's set this up as a Git repository. So we'll initialize it, add all the files, and commit them. This stages the files ready to be pushed up to Git. So these files are all ready to push. So what we need to do is point our local Git state at GitHub. So we're going to use the command that they give us to point it there. We've done that. And finally, we need to push our files up. So that is done. And we can now see that our Salesforce application that we had in our IDE on our local machine is in GitHub. So that's cool. But what do we do with it? Well, the next thing we need to do is create a Scratch org. So I don't know if anybody of you saw the talk from Claire on creating using SFDX. That was a great introduction. So I'm not going to go too deep into what I'm doing here. But if you didn't catch her talk, I'm sure watching the recording would be great. There's also tons of information on SFDX and how to use it. There's trailhead modules and all of that sort of thing. So force org create -a. I'm going to give it an alias so I can refer to it easily later. I'm going to call it FTD. And we're going to give it a config file that kind of defines the shape of our Scratch org. There's nothing really that interesting in this config file. It's just a generic dev org. So that's going to run. And it will take a moment. As I say, there's tons of documentation on this, how to use SFDX, and it's worth learning, because even if you don't get as far as CI, just having this SFDX process is a major benefit. So hopefully it will create my Scratch org. There we go. So we've now got our Scratch org, and Scratch org's kind of like a sandbox. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. So we're going to push our code in there. SFDX force source push. We need to specify a username. That can either be the username on the screen here that we've just got, or we can give it the alias we created earlier. So we'll do that. And that's going to push all of our code up to our freshly created Scratch org. You can see it's added our application there. So you can also open the Scratch org, you've SFDX force org open, but we don't need to do that now. So let's go back to our presentation. So let's run through what I actually did here. I created a repository or a place in Git to store our Salesforce application. Set that up and pushed the code that I already had on my local machine into that repository. Then I created a Scratch org for me to actually do my work. Scratch orgs are like sandboxes, but they're ephemeral. They only last, 7, 14, 30 days, depending on how long you configure them to. And they're only designed to be used for kind of one specific purpose. So for working on a particular feature or working on a particular bug fix. But they are a full Salesforce environment, and you can use them to create fields and objects and all of that sort of thing that you would do normally in a sandbox. The added advantage is you can pull those changes down from your Scratch org into your Git repository very easily. So now we've got a Git repository and a Scratch org, and maybe we've made some changes or we want to make some changes. Let's set up CIRCLECI to actually automate this for us. So, where's my mouse gone? There we go. I'm going to go to CIRCLECI, and we're going to find our Git repository that we created. Hopefully it will show up in a second. There it is. I'm going to set up the project. Now while that's running, I'm going to show you the configuration for our... my mouse seems to have disappeared. Why is it doing this? There it is. I'm going to show you the configuration for Circle. Circle is configured using YAML files, fairly easy to read configuration files. So what we're going to do here is this is a very basic continuous integration setup. We're going to have just 2 steps. The first one, when we push changes into a feature branch, we're going to check that code out from Git. We're going to install our dependencies in our little Circle container that it's created for us. It's like a little Linux VM. We're going to create a Scratch org. We're going to push our code into that Scratch org and run all our tests. Then we can be sure that what we've done works. And then we're going to have another job here to deploy to production. So when we're happy with what we've done in our feature branch and we merge it into our master branch, which should kind of mimic production, we're going to deploy the contents of that master branch to our production org. So you can see down here, these jobs, we're going to ignore every branch that isn't master for our build job, and we're going to listen only to master for our deploy prod job. So let's go back to Circle and see if it's ready yet. Looks like it is. So we're going to start building. Now this job is going to fail straight away because we have one more thing we need to do. So I'm just going to cancel it. And we need to change some settings. Because we haven't told Circle how it can connect to Salesforce. It doesn't know how to log into Salesforce, how to create Scratch orgs. It doesn't know any of that yet. So the way we do that is through environment variables. In this particular instance, we have 3 environment variables that allow Circle to log into Salesforce, run SFDX commands, and create Scratch orgs and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to start by adding those. So the first one, and I've got these helpfully in a note here, is our production user. SFDC under prod, under prod user. Now, this is just my login for my particular sandbox. However, you really should have a dedicated continuous integration user for this sort of thing. But for the purposes of this, we will just have our prod user. So we're going to add another one, which is from our connected app. Now, in order to get Circle to talk to Salesforce, we need a connected app. I created this one ahead of time because they take like 10 minutes to provision, and that's half my talk, so I'm not going to wait around for it. But I've created this connected app, and it gives us a consumer key, consumer secret. It also has a certificate, which I'll show you how to create in a moment. So we're going to need that consumer key. So we're going to put that consumer key in here. We need the title for this, which is SFDC prod client ID. Now finally, we need our certificate. Normally you would do this step first before you create your connected app, but we already have ours. So I've got a helpful little script to generate a certificate for us. Now this script is in this repository, and at the end of this talk, I'll show you where you can get this repository to use it if you want to start your own continuous integration journey. So we're going to follow the prompts. We're going to generate some certificates. So we'll say FR because we're in France and we're in Paris, and we'll leave the rest blank. Now that's generated this big old string here, which we would use as our next environment variable. So I'm going to go back and get the one we've prepared earlier. Copy that. And I don't know why my mouse keeps disappearing. That's okay. Paste that in there and get our key, which is SFDC server key. Cool. So now we've told Circle how it can log into Salesforce.
I think there is 2 missing equals
Oh, I think you might be right. Yes, let's recreate that then. Thank you for grabbing that, because otherwise this wouldn't work. So let's recopy this. Try that again. There we go. SFDC. Server. Okay, there we go. Right. So now, hopefully, we've told Circle how it can log into Salesforce. So what we could do is go back and rerun that job, but that would, of course, deploy what we've done, what we've got in our master branch into production. Maybe we don't want to do that right now. So let's recap what we did. So we created a new Circle CI build. We told Circle the Git repo that we wish to use, and we told it how to get into Salesforce. With a combination of that config.yaml file, some shell scripts, and those environment variables, Circle knows how to log into Salesforce, how to create scratch orgs, and how to deploy our code. So finally, let's kind of put this all together. So we'll go back to our browser. Now this is our production org. If we have a look at this little Lightning component, it currently says hello from Bristol. That's what it is right now. So we're not in Bristol, so we need to change it. But first, we need to create a new branch for our little feature. So I'm using VS Code here to create this branch, but you could equally use the command line or any other Git tool. So we'll call it FTD. So I've got a branch to work on my changes in. So let's just simply change it, hello from Paris, and save. So we've saved that, but now we need to commit. So we'll commit that, and we'll just put a message of FTD. These commit messages should sort of explain what you've done and what you've changed. And then finally, we will push that to our Git repository. So that's going to create, if it would work, let's just do it from here. And we'll set the upstream. Sorry, seems like my configuration in VS Code isn't quite right. But that's okay. We can use the command line instead. And we have. So now if we go and look in GitHub, we should see we recently pushed a branch, and we can create a pull request. So normally you would put links to like Jira tickets or Trello boards or whatever other information here that you've used to track your changes. You would write some commentary about what you've done, but for the purposes of this, let's just leave it blank. But what we do get is we can see that Circle's run off and is building our changes to make sure they're right. And we can also see, if we go and look at the files changed, exactly what got changed. You can imagine this for 5, 6, 10, 20 files that you've changed, or one of your colleagues has changed. You can understand exactly what they've done, which is quite useful. So Circle is now installing our dependencies, so that means it's installing SFDX, getting ready to deploy this to a scratch org just to test it out to make sure it works. This can take quite some time. In a sort of production environment, you would probably want to have your own container image with SFDX and any other prereqs already installed to save some time, but for the purposes of this, it's fine. So we've logged into prod, we're creating a scratch org. Now we are going to push our code and we're going to run all of our tests. You can see that Circle's doing that here for us. And it looks like that's worked, so we've uploaded our test results, and it tells us up here, we ran one test, the slowest one was the only one we ran, and it took 0.02 of a second. If you had any test failures, you'd see them up here. You can clearly go and see what went wrong and go back and fix your code. So that's great. If we go back into GitHub, we can see that our checks have now passed. We can see that our build was successful, and we're happy enough with this, so let's merge it into production. Merge it into master, which will push it into production. So by merging our pull request, we can go back into Circle and have a little look, and it should have started, or here it is, started our deployment to production. So once again, it's installing the dependencies. We can see that if we look in production, nothing's changed yet. We haven't yet deployed. But once this job is finished, we will see excuse me, that Circle has pushed our code up into prod, and it should now match what we had in our branch, what we wrote on our local machine in VS Code, what would be in our Scratch org. So let's just go and check on the progress of that. It looks like it's nearly finished installing SFDX. So we'll just wait a moment for that. While we're waiting for that, you don't only have to check against your a Scratch org or something for your builds. You could get more interesting and install things like JavaScript linters if you're doing a lot of Lightning Web components or normal Lightning components. You could install code static analysis tools like PMD. All of these steps can run every time you commit to your Git repo to ensure that your code is working as expected and is up to standard. But we can see that our deployment to production, well, it says it was successful, so let's go and have a look. Hopefully this will say hello from Paris, and it does. So we can see that we took a piece of code all the way from developing it in our Scratch org, all the way into production, without any change sets, without any fuss, even configuring and setting up CIRCLECI in this time. So what was the point of all of this? Why did I stand up here for 20 minutes to explain this to you? Well, the main thing is CI is not as difficult as you think. Yep, getting to a state where you can use SFDX in the command line and all of that stuff might take a little while. But once you're there, you can start to really harness the power of these sort of things. If you're already there, if you're already using Scratch orgs, if you're already using the Salesforce CLI, you've already got most of your source code maybe in Git, then getting started doesn't take long. As you see, I set this up 20 minutes. Yeah, okay, I had a couple of things pre-prepared, but let's say it would take you less than a day to set this up if you're already at that stage. If you spend this little bit of time to do this, it will make your life much easier. You will be able to see the benefits of it quite quickly. Even start to finish, this was probably quicker than using a change set. Like deploying a Lightning component across 2 environments, this was probably faster. Once you've got this set up, then you can, as I alluded to before, go further with it. You can start to use other tools. You can even have builds that run automatically on a time period. You can use GitHub releases if you want. You can use other tooling like static analysis and linting. You can have it do other interesting things, send emails, do alerts, all that sort of stuff. Anything you can kind of script, you can have your continuous integration platform do. You can have production deployments at the click of a button if you want. It just makes life so much easier for your developers, especially if there's a large kind of group of you working on a particular project. So here's some useful resources and links. There's a QR code there you can scan, which goes to a page on my blog that kind of details all this stuff. I gave this talk at Dreamforce last year, so that's why it says Dreamforce 2018. You can also go to this GitHub repository, which I'm going to quickly go to now. This is a copy of all of this code. You could clone this and get started with CI. It does include my little hello Lightning component, but you can get rid of that and replace it with your own code. But that's it. So if there's any questions, I think I've got like 2 minutes left. Otherwise, I will happily take them after. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I'll leave this one up so you can take pictures. A question down there?
Any recommendation for a good starting point for a matrix org? Because normally you have a lot of metadata and you don't want to pull down all the metadata on your production org, and that's always for me the hardest point, to figure out the best practice, how to untangle your happy system somehow.
It is. If you're building something new and you can possibly build it in a package, that might be a good place to start if you're trying to deploy some new functionality. Likewise, you could start with just, and this is slightly risky, it depends on how many developers you have and how many admins you have and all of this sort of thing, but you could start with just things like Apex code and Lightning components. Profiles, as mentioned in the other talk on SFDX, are the hardest part here. So if you can start to move towards a permission set-based approach, that will help you out a lot. But getting your metadata into from a mature org into Git is a pain, but once you get there, then you can really realize these benefits. One more question, if I've got time? Sure.
You have 2 user stories developed and validated
Yep.
And finally, we decide to deploy only one user story.
Mm-hmm.
But two user story use the same classes.
Yep.
For example, can we deploy
So
once without impact?
you could. So if your two user stories both branched from your production org and both referencing the same pieces of code, and they're both in separate branches, so they're kind of running alongside each other. If you decide this one's not going to happen anymore, you don't need to deploy it, you can just continue to push this one through. It will keep using the code that it's already kind of taken a cutoff from master. You could, if the two user stories need to come together, you could merge the two branches into a third branch before you go to production with it. There's lots of different branching strategies that you can use. So one of the resources here talks about Git flow. That's one that's worth looking into to kind of understand how you can have these things interact. But I think that's all I've got time for. So as I say, any further questions, I'll be around. You can come and chat to me. Thanks again.